Okay, not quite yet.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us here in the library. I'm Sam Riegel, the Reference and Instruction Librarian here at CalArts. I'm also the library liaison to critical studies, which is why I'm particularly excited to be here today. And I'm not going to give much of an intro. I just want to, while I have you, to say that if you are in the room or watching this and you are a current critical studies student, I would love to work with you to support you in your research. And I also just want to shout out the fabulous resources that we have here at the library, more than what you might expect. We have a robust archive all about CalArts history. We have artist books, lots of cool collections. So please do check us out. I brought some cards here if anyone would like to take one. And I hope to see you around. And I hope that we can host more events here in this space. So I will turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you so much. I'm Andrew Culp. I'm a professor in the Aesthetics and Politics program and will be working as the interim program director in the spring as well. So it's my job to welcome you here. Of course, the library is a really excellent host and we hope to ally with them a lot. And it's a natural sort of connection because the Aesthetics and Politics program is the only research-focused program here in CalArts. And so that means that using these resources, digging into the books, understanding the material at a really deep level is so quite important. And so library really feels like home while we're here. And so to feature some of that research today, we've brought back 2 recent graduates of our MA Aesthetics Politics program, as well as someone in their second year working on their thesis. And it's a really excellent opportunity to see what these long 2 years, the deep process of writing and thinking, getting feedback, not getting feedback, re-engineering the project and then looking back at it, it's finished and being really proud of something that you might not have even thought about this would be your final topic, but it turns out just sort of perfect in the end, or that you've just been working on the same thing all along. We also hope this is a great opportunity for current or even prospective students to see what the final thesis sort of looks like. It can seem like a very large hill to climb, but we've got some experts here who are already there who can sort of give very practical advice or other forms of feedback if people have questions, whether in the audience or people online or afterward. I'm sure they'd be happy to answer questions. And then a second year student who's in the middle of the process right now, having transitioned out of the thesis class and is doing the research, doing the thinking, trying to really plan out what a thesis is going to look like. And so we're so excited to have you all today. Our order is going to be Ryan, who's going to be speaking on a thesis. He'll introduce it more himself, but I was his reader, and so I had the opportunity of working really closely. And it has always been sort of a project about doing sort of comparative historical work in and through gay studies and queer studies. But he found a really important sort of vein to mine about a show that happened here in the 80s, in and against the sort of New York art scene, and we'll see all those sort of conflicts and their beauty and their frustrations arise. We have Shu, who has a really wonderful collection of literary and cultural resources going through a number of different contexts. And we're going to hear some wonderful writing here today that's part of a work in progress. And then finally, Natalie is going to present on your thesis too, which was about social media, how youth interact with the internet, and the nascent critiques that have developed about the internet, but some of the limitations maybe that come from them as well. So join me in a hand of applause, waiting for our speakers to come up and present. We're going to go, what, about 15 minutes apiece? Yeah, cool. So thank you so much.
Hey everyone, I'm Ryan Mangione, recent graduate of the Aesthetics and Politics program. I want to thank the library for having us, and thank you so much, Andrew, for that introduction. So I'm just going to present on my thesis that I just completed this past spring. I thought about, kind of trying to map out a full presentation of it, and then realized it might just make more sense to read from the introductions, and hopefully if I've done the job right with writing, that should be, the best kind of overview of the thesis itself. Without any kind of further ado, I'm just going to get into it. Jean Genet's first novel, Our Lady of the Flowers, opens with a death. More specifically, it opens with the death of its protagonist, Divine. Safely positioned at the windowsill of Divine's decrepit tower attic bedroom, the reader watches from above as a small chorus of shrieking queens follow Divine's meager funeral procession, wailing and spilling gossip in equal proportion. Divine is Genet, or more precisely, Divine is a fictional rendering of Genet, against which he'll occasionally position himself, exposing the stark reality of his condition. A lonely homosexual who is writing Divine's life story on scraps of paper from within the solitude of a prison cell. Divine's death is not important here. It merely sets the pretext for the ensuing story, lending a type of predetermined tragic structure to what follows. In the next scene, which takes place roughly 20 years earlier, Divine sits down at a table in a Montmartre cafe. The waiters exchange snickers. The manager frets about how to get her out of the cafe without causing a scene. From this point, everything dissolves. Quote, on her ankle could be seen a chain fastened by a locket which we know contained a few hairs. She smiled all around, and each one answered only by turning away, but that was a way of answering. The whole cafe thought that the smile of, in parentheses, for the colonel, the invert, for the shopkeepers, the fairy, for the banker and the waiters, the fag, for the gigolos, that one, etc., was despicable. Divine did not press the point. From a shiny black satin purse, she took a few coins, which she laid noiselessly on the marble table. The cafe disappeared, and Divine was metamorphosed into one of those monsters that are painted on walls, chimeras or griffins. For a customer, in spite of himself, murmured a magic word as he thought of her: homosexual. Homosexuality is an issue of classification. Layers of naming, categorization, and evaluation, both from within and without, heap themselves upon both the homo's body and psyche, creating a strange funhouse of different shapes and tropes to try on, each seemingly fitted to a different static iteration of history. Taxonomy, as Andrea Long-Chu writes, is taxidermy. Divine appears to slip in and out of a variety of registers, moving from the freakish to the cute enough to the secretly envied, before her narrative continuity collapses somewhat comically through the utterance of that most profane of terms, homosexual. From this debased condition, Divine must go about reassembling her figure, learning to live again through an appropriative collaging of different identities and styles. In the wake of her death, both literal in the opening funeral sequence and figurative in the utterance of the word homosexual, she must learn to fashion a life out of dead and antiquated sensibilities like the faggot, the queen, the broad, the daughter, the mother, the chick. Divine is herself a construction for another discontent homosexual, which is, of course, Genet. As Genet often reminds the reader, her story is primarily meant to bring him pleasure from within the confines of his cell, to alleviate both his suffering and to fill his dejected life with a fantasy of meaning. Living in the wake of his own expulsion from society, Genet spends his days concocting an ideal world of his own, sifting through old sensibilities and styles in search of an aesthetic that might make his life worth living. He sees little worthy of adoration in the world around him, and yet clings determinately to the promise that he might one day experience a true and pure beauty that matches the cadence of his desire. It is with Genet's sensibility in mind that I find myself writing. Outside of homosexuality, Genet and I have almost nothing in common. He was a petty thief turned French literary sensation. I grew up in a middle-class family, half in the suburbs of LA, half in the suburbs of Seattle, and I'm writing an art school master's thesis. And yet, as I will attempt to point out, it is exactly these types of imaginative interfacings with the dead that define the way we understand and experience homosexual history. At any given moment, in any given life, different tracks and lineages of gay history appear to take on a significant role in constituting the self-understandings and identifications of groups or even entire generations of homosexuals, while at the same time, others appear to fall by the wayside. It is impossible, on the one hand, to envision any sort of cleanly defined or linear history of homosexuality, which is, of course, a term and concept of identity which is within itself incredibly young, comparatively speaking. At the same time, it is equally impossible to deny the fact that certain homosexual tropes and sensibilities appear to recur throughout disparate moments in time, as if providing their adoptees a type of historical precedent for understanding their own lived experience. A sense of lost history begets a people who will fashionably imagine histories of their own. It feels impossible to fashion a history of homosexuality today without passing through the AIDS epidemic. For those of us born into the era of protease inhibitors of 1995 onward or so, The AIDS epidemic is invariably a measuring post against which we will try to locate ourselves. It marks the distance between an era defined by an earnest faith in sexual politics and a current generation's earnest desire for said faith. It invariably embodies, quote, progress, resilience, ancestry, loss, privilege, responsibility, forgetting, mourning, remembrance, and on and on and on. Not unlike the death that conditions the beginning of Our Lady of the Flowers, AIDS often appears to take the shape of a prologue, an irrevocable loss or alteration through which successive generations must reconfigure their sense of self. The AIDS epidemic was a period of both immense loss and immense production. Set against the urgency of crisis, countless artists and activists devoted themselves to the task of developing new forms of culture, action, and belonging, whether in the name of saving their lives or in the name of imparting a lasting trace of themselves upon the world. As Greg Bordowitz recollects, everything mattered. The food we ate, our lovers, how we loved, the clothes we wore, the music we listened to, and most importantly, the mediums we used to make art. No single art movement emerged from our situation. There was no dominant consensus about how to make art in the face of the epidemic. I found a sense of self-purpose through my early encounters with the work of artists and writers lost to the AIDS epidemic. Derek Jarman's Jubilee showed me a world in which grandiose faggot pageantry could exist alongside an anarchic punk outlook. Hervé Gibert's To the Friend Who Did Not Save My Life showed me the importance of adoring humanity and distrusting anyone with too clear a political stance. David Wojnarowicz showed me the moral value, as well as the danger and indulgent self-importance of having a hero. Not unlike the life story that unfolds throughout Our Lady of the Flowers, the narratives we tell ourselves about the AIDS epidemic are self-directed fictions of a sort, more so an index of what the living imagine they need from history than a direct rendering of the actual contours of another's life. I find it hard not to resent the way AIDS history has been told to us. And I'm not talking about obviously tacky ahistorical instances of AIDS-era figures being whitewashed, like, say, a mural of Keith Haring hanging above a paint with friends while you drink cocktail bar, or the New York Times, the New York Crimes, as ACT UP commonly referred to them, eulogizing Larry Kramer as a difficult man whose anger often got in the way of his message. I genuinely do not believe that anyone is actually shocked by these sorts of things. Rather, I'm referring to the startlingly limited repertoire of frameworks we seem to have, whether academic, artistic, or critical, for representing the relationship between AIDS and homosexuality in our current moment. Over the course of the past decade, there's been an astounding increase in cultural hunger for, read, financial interest in works that address the height of the epidemic. These works almost invariably center on New York City and ACT UP, with the occasional change of scenery thrown in to spice things up. So the movie BPM follows ACT UP Paris, or the miniseries It's a Sin takes place in London, although the protagonists get most of their initial information about AIDS during a trip to New York, so kind of half in, half out. The more ubiquitous and occasionally valuable iterations of this trend include republished AIDS-era books, plays, and films, newly published histories of the academic, and retrospective exhibitions and documentaries featuring AIDS-era artists. More puzzlingly, contemporary AIDS-oriented films like Dallas Buyers Club, shows like Pose and It's a Sin, and books like The Great Believers have almost unanimously mirrored the aesthetics of the simultaneous booming revival industry going on. They tend to almost without fail trend towards the genre of historical fiction. These new accounts, practically without variation, couch themselves in the narrative container of a recognizable AIDS-era past, relying upon a contemporary audience's sense of hindsight to shoulder the bulk of the work of communicating meaning. So, for example, early on in the first episode of Russell T Davies' It's a Sin, the show's main protagonist mockingly tosses a condom that his father gave him, supposedly to protect him from getting someone pregnant, off the side of a ferry while he's on his way to his new home in London. He coyly remarks that he has no use for it. And so the scene takes place in the early 80s. So the entire tragic pathos of the scene, in a sense, relies upon a present-day audience being able to somberly recognize that which the protagonist himself cannot, which is that the heyday of condomless gay sex is about to come crashing down. For all the tremendous cultural output to have come out of the AIDS epidemic of our present is a singular, monolithic, and largely superficial caricature of itself. It has been abstracted from any sort of historical context, made to take on a seemingly endless array of contemporary political, aesthetic, and cultural struggles for which it was never meant to answer. The ruling narrative of AIDS history is that of the martyr, the tragic soul who is destined to become politicized through their fatal struggle with the virus and who is thus doomed to watch over the future generations, ever in wait of final redemption. This narrative of martyrdom has stifled any type of forward motion within homosexual culture, aesthetics, or political consciousness, trapping the living in a constant relation of indebtedness to a lost generation who never asked for such a fate. It has also created an albatross out of the dead, perverting the complexity of their lives into a romantic narrative of inevitable social progress, one designed primarily to bolster the same dominant cultural and political powers that the dead sought to resist. As Sarah Schulman writes, unlike my generation, who were told we were despised, younger generations are told that things are better than they are. They have to go through the difficult process of learning to realistically evaluate from their own lived experience, instead of from what they are told about themselves. One of the tasks of our present is to ask how things came to be like this. In an attempt to partially answer this question, I've turned to the infamous 1989 Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibition's release show Against Nature, a group show of work by homosexual men. Curated by the writer Dennis Cooper and the artist Richard Hawkins, Against Nature drew together a wide array of visual, written, video, and performance works, each of which attempted to grapple with the theme of homosexual desire as it was being experienced by the show's participants during the height of the AIDS epidemic. Widely rumored, even prior to its opening, to be an anti-activist exhibition, Against Nature was the subject of intense admiration, incisive criticism, and a healthy dose of vitriol. Queer Nation, for instance, staged a die-in during the opening night, helping to ignite what would become a long, protracted debate over the value and impact of the show's content. And to be clear, it's important to note that the claim that the show was anti-AIDS activism was something that was never put forth by anyone involved in the show. Hawkins and Cooper have both independently acknowledged the political importance of AIDS activism, and a number of the show's participants were either close friends of key active figures or, in other cases, heavily involved in AIDS activism themselves. The works assembled in Against Nature delve deep into the themes of irony, irreverence, fear, delirium, and abject desire, producing images of homosexual desire which, while sometimes nodding towards the presence of AIDS, are resolutely not declarative of any clear political position. For those close to my age, the story may come as surprising. Against Nature is almost entirely non-existent in surviving accounts of art during the AIDS epidemic, a fact which appears to strangely contradict the intense amount of attention it courted during the months both leading up to and following its exhibition. More interestingly, however, this story also seems to contradict the prevailing contemporary narrative around AIDS art, which tends to portray a rather unfussy story of homosexuals collectively unified in the articulation of a shared message of political resistance. The targets of AIDS activism's ire are typically assumed to be obviously reprehensible characters like Jesse Helm, Ronald Reagan, Cardinal John Joseph O'Connor. Furthermore, homosexuals who have come under fire within AIDS activist discourse are generally critiqued for espousing the wrong politics. So most notably, this is Andrew Sullivan, and to a lesser extent, people like Larry Kramer, Mark Harrington, and Peter Staley. This is as opposed to not espousing any political message, period, which was the critique leveled against Nature. And to further complicate this tangle of historical amnesia, many of the artists involved in Against Nature are also celebrated figures within the canon of the gay aesthetic and literary history. They include Gary Indiana, Kevin Killian, Dennis Cooper, Vaginal Davis, Peter Christopherson of Throbbing Gristle and Coil, Nayland Blake, John Grayson. So this historical amnesia is not, in other words, simply reducible to the actions of a fringe group of forgotten 80s provocateurs. Against Nature is immensely valuable to anyone interested in better understanding the cultural, political, and aesthetic trajectory of homosexuality from the AIDS epidemic to our present. This value, I will argue, is primarily rooted in the discursive struggle that Against Nature helps illuminate. More so than any single work within the show itself, the general proposition posed by Against Nature, as well as the bit of criticism incited by this proposition, allows us to glimpse a moment in which AIDS history had not yet become subsumed under the rubric of a single limiting discourse. In doing so, Against Nature also allows us to better understand the various positions adopted towards the question of AIDS art and homosexual representation, repositioning them as expressions of fundamentally divergent self-understandings of homosexuality, each of which is partially conditioned by the material and cultural conditions through which it emerged, as well as by the particular political and aesthetic challenges it sought to address. So this is not a cultural history of against nature, nor is it a piece of straightforward art criticism. My interest is not to merely point to an instance of exclusion within AIDS history. I'm not interested in simply complicating the existing narrative of AIDS history by adding another set of data. Rather, I'm interested in using a different set of data as an entry point for destroying the existing narrative of AIDS history altogether. My fundamental concern is for how this narrative has come to bear upon the concept of homosexuality. This is not a gripe about the waning cultural relevance of gay men. If anything, I argue that there's currently little in the way of anything politically radical about homosexuality, and that this does not seem likely to change soon. At the same time, this writing is an insistence on the need for a significantly more nuanced, culturally engaged, and frankly, life-affirming approach to the ways in which we conceptualize and represent homosexuality today. This need, as I refer to it, is a measure of the degree to which contemporary sexual cultures, aesthetics, and imaginations have become almost comically bland, pseudo-intellectual, and overtly morally restrictive. To this end, while my focus remains on homosexuality, my arguments invariably end up entangling themselves in larger questions of the political value of art, the life and death affirming tendencies of art, and the way in which geography and socioeconomic forces determine both their sense of self as well as of history. I don't profess to have any final answers about these questions because I don't think anyone ever has or ever will. The act of pretending otherwise is one of the most destructive tendencies to have ensnared contemporary culture, in fact. I'm only interested in writing for the sake of pushing homosexual history out of its current state of deadlock. And I'm only interested in doing this because the current state of homosexual history appears to stand between myself and the fantasies of a more artful and worthwhile type of living that populate my imagination. In this sense, I'm not writing out of a sense of obligation towards homosexuality, but rather out of a sense of obligation to my own discontent and desire, out of which homosexuality happens to intersect. In the words of one of my favorite homosexuals, there's no art where there's no style, and no style where there's no unity, and unity is of the individual. It's Oscar Wilde. So in chapter 1, I sketched two divergent tropes of homosexuality, the militant and the melancholic, tracing the ways in which they comparatively understand homosexuality and its relationship to both art and politics. I then provide an account of the conception and production of Against Nature. I argue that Against Nature embodied a primarily melancholic sensibility, effectively placing it at odds with the militant sensibility espoused by ACT UP affiliated art critics like Douglas Crimp. Finally, I analyze the ways in which moments of heightened conflict, such as those brought on by the urgency of the AIDS epidemic, transform and overdetermine tropes like melancholia and militancy, misrepresenting what are in reality fundamentally distinct self-understandings of homosexuality, as if they were competing and mutually exclusive claims over a single definition of homosexuality writ large. In chapter 2, I perform a close reading of 3 written contributions to Against Nature's catalog: The Code of the Sentiments by Gary Indiana, Dear Secret Diary by Dennis Cooper, and Cherry by Kevin Killian. These 3 pieces, I argue, clearly flesh out a melancholic homosexual sensibility. Specifically, they depict desire as an opaque and uncontrollable force, moral perfection as being only possible on the level of fantasy, and homosexuality as a fundamentally artificial, self-defeating type of gesture. Through this close reading, I argue that not only are the works collected in Against Nature explicitly socially engaged with the AIDS epidemic, but also, furthermore, that they manage to address dimensions of the AIDS epidemic that militant activism is fundamentally incapable of addressing on its own. At heart, I argue that counter to the arguments of Against Nature's critics, that Against Nature takes out a very clear position, defined social position, defined foremost by an assertion of individuality over collective morality, as well as by a broad-reaching philosophy of discontent. In chapter 3, I address the historical significance of Against Nature within the wider discourse of AIDS history. First, I contextualize Against Nature within the prevailing discourse and political context of its era, arguing that one of the unintended byproducts of AIDS activism was a fundamental reduction of the scope of recognizable representations of homosexual desire. Next, I perform a close reading of criticisms published in response to Against Nature, with particular attention paid to Douglas Crimp's essay, Good Old Bad Boys. Through this close reading, I attempt to explain how the controversy surrounding Against Nature was indicative of a larger conflict between competing homosexual tropes played out over the course of the AIDS epidemic. Finally, I attempt to historicize these tropes as distinct responses to the geographic and cultural context from which they emerge, arguing that, if viewed from the context of their production, neither trope is fundamentally antagonistic to the other. From this historical account, I conclude that we no longer live in a material moment capable of producing the type of collective gay politics embodied by militant AIDS activism. In Chapter 4, I analyze the lasting impact of militancy's triumph over melancholy within the AIDS discourse. To do so, I turn to the legacy of David Wojnarowicz, tracing the ways in which his work has been reappropriated and recontextualized as activist art, primarily for the benefit of elite cultural institutions. This reappropriation, I argue, is a shining example of the process through which AIDS history has become condensed into a single narrative framework, which I refer to as the AIDS martyr narrative. The AIDS martyr, I argue, has fundamentally distorted and deformed our contemporary understanding of AIDS history, creating a self-reproducing cycle of redemption and indebtedness, which has largely derailed contemporary homosexual aesthetics and politics. In the conclusion, I attempt to provide an account of the current state of homosexual history. I turn to the late Christopher Chitty's concept of queer realism, in an attempt to theorize an aesthetic sensibility that can counteract the stifling form of moralism that has been imposed upon homosexuality by the AIDS martyr narrative. Through this, I argue that the melancholic sensibility embodied by Against Nature offers a compelling and prescient starting point for an aesthetic movement bent on reinvigorating homosexual culture. So this piece is a polemic. It should not be read as an attempt to make any lasting or definitive statement on the nature of homosexuality, nor on the value of collective activism. I feel the need to stress that I have the utmost admiration for AIDS activism. I don't want to even begin to think of what the world would look like without the existence of ACT UP. At the same time, in order to properly understand something, it is often necessary to observe it from a debased and deflated position. I would like to think that the critical scrutiny I place on figures like Douglas Crimp and Sarah Schulman in the following pages is an extension of the same critical scrutiny that they have so energetically fought to foster and preserve. In this sense, I would hope that my criticisms of AIDS activism's oversights are taken as an expression of my deep care and investment in truly understanding their work for what it actually was. In his critique of Against Nature, Douglas Crimp accused Cooper and Hawkins of self-aggrandizement for drawing comparisons between themselves and Genet. In the spirit of this accusation, I would like to offer the following Genet quote as an extension of my relationship towards the work of Crimp and his compatriots. By the gravity of the means I require to thrust you from me, measure the tenderness I feel for you. Judge to what degree I love you from the barricades I erect in my life and work, since the work of art should be the only proof of my saintliness. Not only must the saintliness be real so that it may fecundate the work, but also that I may brace myself on a work already strong with saintliness for a greater effort towards an unknown destination, so that your breath, I am corruptible to an extreme, may not rot me. My tenderness is of fragile stuff, and the breath of men would disturb the methods for seeking a new paradise. I shall impose a candid vision of evil, even though I lose my life, my honor, and my glory in this quest. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Am I heard? Hi. Okay. I want to thank Jackie and Rosa for putting this event together. You guys are so awesome. And I also want to thank Andrew for the introduction. Before I start, I would like to say that I may have to leave a little bit earlier today, so I won't be here for the Q&A. So if you have any questions, ideas, or even criticism, I would really love to receive them. And if you don't know how to contact me, please reach out to Jackie, and Jackie will help me give you guys my contact information. So tonight, I'm going to read fragments from an essay that I wrote about 1 year ago for Andrew's contemporary political theory course. In a 1982 interview, Miles Davis calls attention to the word jazz by saying, "I don't like that word jazz. I think social music. Davis seems to stress that jazz is not simply an insulated aesthetic product, which either originates from a single musician's point of view or communicate only with itself as a pure standard of art that no one can reach. But rather, it's a socially originated, constructed, and interactive art. What does it mean to be a social music in terms of birth, development, and reception? Davis' idea for naming jazz is shared with Nina Simone, who famously expressed her dislike of the word jazz and her preference for naming it Black classical music. To most white people, to most white people, jazz means black and jazz means dirt. And that is not what I play. I play Black classical music. That's why I don't like the term jazz. And Duke Ellington didn't either. It's a term that's simply used to identify Black people. What Davis and Simone witnessed day after day and attempted to problematize is the way the term jazz may seem to be originated, performed, and composed in the course of Black life. The audience of jazz calls this music jazz, a term without a specificity of the author, the condition, or the art form, but usually interpreted to mean the music of Black people. Or, in another attempt, it's a term which points to a shared cultural implication about the group who plays jazz. Such a shared cultural implication fixed in the term jazz denotes a mixed feeling of the social response, biased gaze towards the lives of Black people, intertwined simultaneously with anxiety and admiration towards the self. Displeased by the inaccuracy and universality of the shared cultural implication and of this term jazz, as well as by the rhetoric related to it in everyday context, Davis and Simone proposed the replacement, social music and Black classical music. But these two terms are themselves in dissonance regarding this musical form. One concerns a shared message about music's mass nature, and the other seeks for a high social and technical status of the music and performer themselves. More precisely, social music equates jazz genre with popular music or with people's music. Black jazz classical music address the technical aspect of music first, the alternative quality of it being technical, classical, or non-popular. Non-people's music or having nothing to do with the social condition of the composer or performer, but the condition of the beauty in the piece's own isolation, either in composition, publication, or live concert. Simone refers to classical music here to designate that Black could be associated with the term classical, which attained both her identity and the right to pursue another name for the Black people and for the music that Black people play, rather than the negative image, dirt, that society had already attributed to jazz and to the group associated with it. In the attempts to pursue the renaming of jazz, these two dissonant views are not in direct opposition to each other. Instead, they come to represent the explicated biased cultural knowledge on jazz and on the Black people. Naming this shared cultural understanding at Davis and Simone's time bias relies on our intuition at this current point of the history, in which the conditions of Black life are structurally constructed in social systems which are themselves racialized and biased. While looking at the structurally racialized and biased social systems can be seen as an external approach to Black life, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man observed and declared a sickness within the invisible man himself. Quote, "The fact is that you carry part of your sickness within you. At least I do as an invisible man. I carried my sickness, and though for a long time I tried to place it in the outside world. The attempt to write it down shows me that at least half of it lay within me. It came upon me slowly, like that strange disease that affects those Black men whom you see turning slowly from Black to albino, their pigment disappearing as under the radiation of some cruel, invisible ray. You go along for years knowing something's wrong. Then suddenly you discover that it's all a dirty joke, or that it's due to the political situation. But deep down, you come to suspect that you are yourself to blame. And you stand naked and shivering before the millions of eyes who look through you unseeingly. That is the real soul sickness. But live you must. You can either make passive love to your sickness or burn it out and go on to the next conflicting phase. Though offered in the epilogue, Ellison's expression sickness within you, strange disease, and real soul sickness accurately capture what has remained as inner sickness that the outer racialized and by social political situation has reinforced and therefore alienated Black life. The alienation that has started since the beginning of slavery and never fully gone away after the formal end of slavery in the late 19th century. Sickness, disease, soul sickness all suggest a sense of illness from the biological to the mental and to the psychic. This passage categorized an order of recognition of the different level of sickness. The invisible man sees himself as carrying the sickness inside, attempts to write the story down as an exploration for this sickness. Realize that such sickness does not come from the individual unit, but exists for all, quote, those Black men. Understood the material, social, and political context that created such sickness, and above all, from this developed his skepticism of the self without help. On one hand, the invisible man first sees his sickness as coming from within. On the other hand, the cause of all illness is not from within. The converging moment of finally knowing that this sickness does not come from him alone is formed in his light and leisurely tone. It's all a dirty joke. Having known that the sickness isn't from within, but from the political situation, is just a dirty joke. But the inertia or the momentum of blaming the self and the endless feeling of being invisible is the real, quote, soul sickness. Such momentum of feeling the invisible self cannot be helped or recovered by the exposure of structurally biased and racialized social system. As Fred Moulton would later put it in his essay, The Case of Blackness, pathology may well have been the central issue of interpreting the psychology, ontology, and epistemology of the Black life. The sickness, disorder, or pathology of the Black life is not of recent phenomenon. When Nina Simone disliked the phrase jazz in relation to its association with dirt, she's on the surface pointing to one racist reference, but deep down referring to the mirroring stage between the social system and the Black people. The color of Black may incorrectly mirror the social understanding of the unclean, and the unequal social gaze imposed a distorted, civilized, or hygienely clean view on the Black people. In part, the social system created an impasse which consequently can produce inward pathology, or in Fanon's term, psychopathology. And this psychopathology was intentionally targeted with most concentrated criticism by the white or the social systems. In other words, pathology serves as a closed circle of discrimination, in which the Black life was initially targeted, bringing an awareness of uneven conditions, but with no other way to pursue a life outside this system. The system ends with living in sickness that then becomes the dominant political world's justification for further oppression. Consequently, when Hales said that a poet cannot be a true poet without accepting who they truly are in the first place, he meant to fuse the universal idea of being an artist with the empirical social condition of a Black artist. Here, the exact mode of thinking of one idea, be purely or in isolation, and having one to look at empirical cases will lead us back to the issues discussed earlier in the essay. Black Americans' inward response to the outward social environment and the extended psychological effects in this inward experience. In other words, the feeling of sickness or the living conflict is always together with Black Americans. In her The Aptness of Anger, Amias Ramasson argues that anger, in the circumstances of political injustice, has intrinsic epistemic value. In one of her case studies, Ramasson told a story of James Baldwin in a radio interview in 1961, being asked to review Langston Hill's poem. Here's what Ramasson quoted in her essay and what Baldwin responded to the question on Hills. Quote, "To be a Negro in this country and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. The first problem is how to control that rage so that it won't destroy you. You have to decide that you can't spend the rest of your life cursing out everybody that gets in your way. As a writer, you have to decide what's really important. It's not that the people you write about are Negroes, but that they're people. And that the suffering of any people is really universal. If you can reach this level, you can create a person and make other people feel what this person feels. Then it seems to me that you have gone much further, not only artistically, but socially." I talked about Langston not being the first poet to find these responsibilities all but irreconcilable. And he won't be the last, because it demands a great deal of stepping out of a social situation in order to deal with it. By looking at Baldwin's discussion of rage, Ramasson speculates that the social and psychological aspect of Black persons in the US involve, in her phrase, two kinds of justice. First, quote, "The daily oppression of being a Black person in the US, impoverishment, ghettoization, threat of physical attack, political and social marginalization, psychic degradation. Second, affective injustice, the injustice of having to negotiate between one's apt emotional response to the injustice of one's situation and one's desire to better one's situation." What's inserted here is in relation to the daily oppression of a Black person and the in-between state of one's emotional response to the injustice and the state of desiring, quote, to better one's situation. Ramasson is correct about the daily oppression and the daily conflict when a Black person approaches the world, handles response to the world, and lives with that process of approaching, handling, and mirroring back to their self. A fruitful idea in the quote passage above is Baldwin's exposure of a necessary awareness that an artist telling the story of their own people should first understand what they mean for any people, if not to understand, then to imagine or to see. What's fruitful here is the connecting elements from their own people to any people, is to understand or imagine or see, quote, "The suffering of any person is really universal." Chiefly, responses from an artist or writer started from understanding the common ground of suffering within all people. Then the artist or writer tells the story of their own people will be enhanced by the sympathetic heart. Baldwin stressed intellectual scrutinization, emotional acceptance, and philosophical pursuits about the general human condition before narrowly concentrated on one's own community. Further, Baldwin, agreeing with Hills about being not only artistically but socially, sketched out a dual character of the Black artist, being both artistic and social. In adapting this quote paragraph from Baldwin, we can add that only the social condition can create a true soul for the artist, and the artistic condition releases the soul and serves as method. In this sense, the social and artistic condition echoes Hill's social condition of a Black artist, but also add one more layer of sympathy among living creatures. Recalling the Invisible Man quote from previously, I propose a reading of the trope of lighting, situated in the beginning of the novel. Lighting comes up twice in the prologue. Quote, I am in the great American tradition of thinkers that makes me kin to Ford, Edison, and Franklin, a thinker-tinker. And the truth is the light. Light is the truth. The protagonist not only lives under the growth of the monopolated light and power company, but also mocks the modernist idea of progress represented by the three inventors here. The supreme, distinct human account of thinking, which is put parallel with the vernacular use of tinker as a lowering of the universal validity of the role of thinking, and the persistent pursuit of the truth. After the prologue, the trope of lighting comes to play, a formal character in the story. In the Battle Royale scene, in which a set of Black teenagers fight for the amusement of a wide audience, the rug they're made to scramble on is fully electrified. By describing the scene as Allison relays the torture of the boys to electricity, put forward a theatrical performance of the boys in relation to electricity, in an attempt to show that the ample sickness of these old white men who enjoy watching the Black boys being tortured. It might be a lemon. It might not be a lemon, nor a political message that Allison's sending. It's a call to truly feel the sickness of the situation. As Ellison writes in the epilogue, quote, you go along for years knowing something's wrong, then suddenly you discover that it's all a dirty joke, or that it's due to the political situation. And he brings this sense of irony to the scene of the boys' torture. And finally, he says, by laughing, I discovered I could contain electricity, a contradiction, but it works. The dirty jokes may have been the political environment, and by laughing, the invisible man contains something lightening. It's in this exact contradiction where the life of the invisible man starts, continues, and haunts. Thank you.
All right, hello. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to Andrew for the intro. My name is Natalie, and like Ryan, I graduated in May. So today I'm going to be reading my abstract and a little bit of my first chapter. And then afterwards I'll talk about, just briefly, about the rest of the thesis and then what I'm working on now. All right, so the abstract. The internet, social media, and influencers are contemporary topics that are often positioned as problems to solve or as the cause of all of our modern problems. When discussing these terms, cliches abound. Social media is tearing us apart, kids these days, etc. This thesis looks to film as a unique pedagogical tool and as a medium that affects and reflects the social, cultural, and political. Instead of seeking to solve these problems or engaging with them in the terms prescribed by sensational media coverage, this thesis examines three films, The Social Dilemma, Inside, and Jawline, and analyzes how each filmmaker, Jeff Orlowski, Bo Burnham, Liza Mandeloop, approaches social media, the internet, and the creator economy, respectively. In chapter 1, I argue that although The Social Dilemma popularized essential ideas around social media, Orlowski ultimately fuels the current social media panic, misrepresents the issues at hand, and provides false solutions. In chapter 2, I argue that Inside better represents the internet and how it interacts with late capitalism, but its critiques are rendered powerless by Burnham's irony and apathy. In the final chapter, I argue that with Jawline, Mandeloop approaches influencers and fangirls in a different way, not telling us about a problem to solve or a solution, but rather asking young people why they do what they do, and then seeking to understand them by representing their fantasies through film. And so my first chapter is titled Jeff Orlowski's The Social Dilemma, Selling Solutions in Social Media Panic. and I'll just be reading the first two sections, which are titled Social Media Panic and The AI Guy. The Social Dilemma, directed by Jeff Orlowski, was released on Netflix in September of 2022. Almost 2 months after its release, the film became Netflix's second most watched documentary, with over 38 million viewers. In the film, Orlowski interviews academics, writers, tech investors, and about a dozen former big tech executives and engineers who speak out against their past work at Facebook, Google, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and more. The main argument of the social dilemma is that social media platforms are designed to be addictive, to promote inflammatory and extremist content, and to manipulate users' emotions and behaviors in order to generate the greatest profit for the tech companies who run them. Now the film's main points have become small talk fodder. Everyone knows social media is designed to be addictive, and if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product. But while the social dilemma helped popularize these essential theories and start a crucial cultural shift against big tech, Orlowski's film propagates dangerous and false ideas about how these theories actually function in practice. The film, in prioritizing scaring its audience over having a nuanced discussion of the topic at hand, epitomizes the current media panic surrounding social media. And Orlowski, in hyper-focusing on describing the problem in the scariest way possible and rushing to prescribe a simplified solution, ends up using the very manipulative tactics the film decries. In addition to the interviews with tech insiders, the film features a narrative story which follows a family of 5 and the ways that social media negatively affects their lives. When teenage protagonist Ben starts watching conspiracy theory videos on his phone, he starts to miss soccer practice and worry his family. This storyline culminates in Ben skipping school to go to a vaguely alt-right rally where he gets arrested for seemingly no reason. His sister shows up to rescue him, but she bumps into a police officer who then arrests her too. The blurry protest slows down around them as the camera focuses on their faces pressed against the ground. The scene is intercut with footage from global protests and rallies. It's unclear what the film is trying to say other than the 21st century version of "Do you know where your children are?" It's a perfect example of the film's reliance on an emotional Mad Lib style of argument. Evil social media companies can influence and even radicalize your addicted children. This method leans heavily on buzzwords to prime its audience to be fearful. A few review headlines can tell you more about how the social dilemma fed into a greater sense of media panic. A horrifyingly good doc about how social media will kill us all. Unplug and Run. The social dilemma is making people terrified of social media. And lastly, the new Netflix documentary will make you want to delete social media forever. Media panic is a term that originates from Stanley Cohen's term moral panics, which he coined in the 1972 classic Folk Devils and Moral Panics. While moral panics are often promulgated by the media panics are about the media. Kristen Drottner defines media panics as follows. The media is both instigator and purveyor of the discussion. The discussion is highly emotionally charged and morally polarized. The medium is either good or bad, with the negative pole being the most visible in most cases. The discussion is an adult discussion that primarily focuses on children and young people. Drottner argues that older media panics focused on outward social evils, but that the current social media panic centers on the psychological ill effects of media. In her words, arguments are being internalized as the media penetrates deeper into our social lives. As a part of their Facebook Files investigation, the Wall Street Journal published an article titled, "Facebook Knows Instagram is Toxic for Teen Girls," which begins, like so many social media panic articles, with an alarming anecdote. About a year ago, teenager Anastasia started seeing a therapist. She had developed an eating disorder and had a clear idea of what led to it, her time on Instagram. Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt speaks with the same urgency and definitiveness when interviewed in The Social Dilemma, claiming that the number of preteen girls hospitalized due to self-harm has tripled since social media use became widespread among middle school-age children. But Haidt's facts are cherry-picked to scare listeners into believing him, and his proof does not hold up to close scrutiny, even if there is some truth to his arguments. To Haidt, social media is the same folk devil that popular literature was in the 1800s, and that film, comics, rock and roll, and TV were in the century after. Karen Leik asserts that, quote, "Many of the dire, even hysterical assessments of the negative effects of social media and smartphones are reminiscent of the anxiety about television in the 1970s. Like those complaints, many include idealized descriptions of technology-free, happy childhoods that apparently contrast with today's depressed, media-addicted young people. Childhood emotions may be being exploited by social media, but these negative feelings are not exclusive to today's youth. Contrary to Haidt's assertions, the childhoods of the past were not perfect, and the childhoods of today are not hopeless. In fact, many studies say the opposite of what Haidt argues, finding a weak or negligible correlation between social media use and mental health. One study, which analyzed large-scale data sets, found that, quote, effects of both smoking marijuana and bullying have a much larger negative association with adolescent well-being than does technology use. Another study concluded that the argument that fast-paced changes to social media platforms and devices have made them more harmful for adolescent mental health in the past decade is not strongly supported by current data. Yet another study found limited evidence for the negative relationship between screen time and mental health in young people. These studies do not claim that social media is a positive or even a neutral factor when it comes to children's well-being, but rather that there is simply no way to have answers with any certainty. There are too many competing and unaccounted for factors, and no way to definitively separate causation from correlation. The social dilemma, on the other hand, believes in oversimplification. Social media is the reason the kids aren't all right, because this allows for an easier sell. Here's the simple problem, social media bad, and here's our simple solution, delete your apps. Social media is a cause for panic, or at the very least serious concern, but it's important to understand the ways in which panics misrepresent social media, and one such way is how Orlowski chooses to represent artificial intelligence. In the narrative portions of The Social Dilemma, Orlowski makes an odd decision that contributes to the film's media panic narrative. He chooses to personify artificial intelligence. Mad Men's Vincent Kartheiser plays 3 versions of AI, all of which are manipulating teenager Ben. The viewer sees the 3 AIs, each in front of their own switchboard, analyzing a hologram version of Ben. They discuss which notification to send when, which advertisement wins the bidding war for his attention, and more generally, what will keep him on his phone. They say stuff like his scrolling speed is slowing, nearing the end of his average session length, decreasing ad load, pull back on friends and family. They do everything short of laughing maniacally while ominously underlit. In one scene, Ben makes a deal with his mom after he cracks his phone screen. If he can stay off of his phone for 1 week, his mom will get his screen fixed for him. The 3-headed AI notices his absence and scours his data to find the perfect push notification to get him to unlock his phone. They find his ex-girlfriend's page, where he used to spend a lot of screen time. She has a new boyfriend. The AI send the notification to let Ben know. Of course, he can't resist opening it and ends up spending all night on social media. The next morning, he's woken up by his sister after falling asleep on top of his covers, phone in hand. Tristan Harris, co-founder of the Center for Humane Technology and arguably the star of the film, defended Orlowski's decision to represent AI this way by reiterating that they represent 3 different real teams of engineers, each with the responsibility to maximize growth, engagement, and advertising respectively. But even so, this choice to represent AI as a trio of villains misrepresents how algorithms function. Yes, AI is designed to learn through trials and feedback, analyzing large amounts of data and learning as it goes, but this learning is designed and enforced by humans. It cannot deviate from the algorithmically programmed goal in order to specifically decide to bring one boy back to his phone. Behavioral modification on social media is not nefariously designed for you and only you. We are collateral damage or simply a means to an end. As Jared Lanier puts it, these addiction algorithms are blind. They're just dumb algorithms. What they want to do is take whatever input people put into the system and find a way to turn it into the most engagement possible. And the most engagement comes from the startle emotions like fear and anger and jealousy. It may be terrible, but it's not personal. At one point in the documentary, Harris says, on the other side of the screen, it's almost as if they had this avatar voodoo doll-like model of us. All the things we've ever done, all the clicks we've ever made, all the videos we've watched, all the likes, that all gets brought back into building a more and more accurate model. The model, once you have it, can predict the kinds of things that a person does. But several authors would disagree with Harris's claim that algorithms are predictors of behavior, including author of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Cathy O'Neill, who Orlowski also interviewed in the film. In her interview, O'Neill explains, I like to say that algorithms are opinions embedded in code, and that algorithms are not objective. Algorithms are optimized to some definition of success. So if you can imagine, if a commercial enterprise builds an algorithm to their definition of success, it's a commercial interest. It's usually profit. The Social Dilemma chooses to show algorithms, AI, and even social media platforms as evil entities with minds of their own, as monsters that ran from their makers, or as Harris describes them, digital Frankensteins. But as O'Neill might argue, these creations are working just as they were designed. There's a page missing. Forget that. Algorithms ultimately are not as smart or as vindictive as their creators would perhaps like them to believe. In fact, they are only as smart or as vindictive as their makers and the systems they worship. Well, that's done for the reading. There was a page missing, but the rest of the chapter was kind of about the way that the film took responsibility away from the people that were interviewed in the film, kind of again by saying, oh, it's that evil AI. And also, they only mentioned capitalism 3 times and it was kind of offhanded. So they take it away from the system as well. And also, there's kind of an absence of history in the film where they are kind of saying, like, look, guys, this is just happening now. This has never happened before. This handful of people are ruining the lives of so many, but they kind of neglect to realize that this has been happening for a long time in many different forms. And so there were some authors that are calling it digital colonialism or digital feudalism. But to these authors, it's just, oh, it's a little problem. We can just tweak it and fix it. And then they put the onus kind of on the viewer to fix it. And they say, they give you a simple solution, come to our website, you can learn, you can read these kind of, you can do these lesson plans, you can teach your kids, and it'll all be okay. So it's kind of, again, simplifying and misrepresenting the problem and then giving that quick and easy solution, because that's what sells their movie. So they're kind of doing the same exact thing that they're complaining about in a way. And it kind of has this feeling of, it's like a script for a dinner party conversation that everybody talks about and then they forget. And then my conclusion ended up being very similar to what Ryan was saying at the end of his, like resisting simplifying things, resisting thinking that you know everything. And yeah, and my next kind of thing that I'm interested in, because it is interesting to return to a work that you wrote so long ago. But now I'm very interested in persona studies, which is the study of the construction of the public self. And I'm very interested in particularly Shia LaBeouf. I tried to write a paper on him when I was in the program, and it didn't quite work because while I was writing it, the FKA Twigs stuff came out, and that really threw a wrench in my plans. And then more recently, more content has come out of him reconstructing his public self. So that's kind of in the works, and I'm very interested in that. And kind of this general idea of disingenuity, which I feel is also, when I was rereading this, it's kind of also in here too. Like it feels disingenuous for all of these tech people to be like, oh, it's really bad and scary, but it's gonna be okay, just listen to me. So yeah, thank you guys for listening. That's the thesis. And if anyone wants to talk about Shia LaBeouf, ask Jackie or my number. Thank you guys.
So maybe what we can do, because it looks like we have just a bit of time still, is bring both of you back up and see if there are any questions that people have. Don't feel put on the spot to ask too many questions, but it's a great opportunity to have people who've done such remarkable work come up here. And then after it feels like that's run its course, then we'll call it, and people can stick around and talk individually.
There could also be just questions about the thesis writing process or that too. Just kind of feel like we both threw a lot of just words at you, you know. But yeah, if anyone has anything to do with it,
Maybe I'll ask a question. I guess I'll do this. But Ryan, what upon rereading, did you find yourself editing it at all?
Yeah, a bit. I think I mean most of it was just kind of like trying to like reorganize it for like to be spoken, you know. Yeah, it was definitely like it was an interesting process of like rereading it and like kind of like it's definitely like moments of like I didn't realize I had said that, you know, and then like there's like a tendency to maybe try to like dial back some of these things about these like more like aggressive claims of some sort,
I
and
felt
try
that
to
big time, yeah.
not do that, I guess. But I'm a little. Have you?
For sure, definitely. And then there were some sections I couldn't read because I felt like I was like, yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, what?
Yeah, it's
Like, are you sure?
all over the place.
Yeah, so I definitely feel that. You get kind of excited when you're finishing it, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
With your claims, yeah.
Yes.
I have a question. This is a bit of a selfish
Yeah.
question. How did you approach voice, both of you, in your thesis, and like when you're, taking such like a research heavy topic, and then because you seem to take a personal a bit, and then you, so the two of you.
No, totally. I mean, that's a good question. And maybe there's a way to like also like that dovetails maybe like kind of like just like a larger question with like writing a thesis is like I think it's like I definitely found it like really kind of like it was like a watershed or breakthrough thing. I think it is like kind of like an essential part of the process of like finding at some point just like picking like a genre, if that makes sense, of what you're writing in, because there's like with any given topic, there's like a number of different, I guess just like thinking in terms of like what the writing process and like the finished product is like sitting within some sort of genre, because that both I think helps clarify certain things that the piece is capable of doing, and also I think in a good way places some sorts of limitations on it. I mean, there's a point writing my thesis where I decided to specifically take up like the genre of like a polemic or something like that, and I think part of that was informed by like I was having a really hard time for a while squaring like trying to find some sort of like like justification for like, well, no, like what they're doing with Against Nature of this show is like still like political activism, like kind of like trying to like fight for like finding some sort of like political argument in there. And I think when I landed on this idea of writing like a polemic and using the show as a way to get at this larger question of like AIDS history, it I think simplified the writing process in a lot of ways, because I felt like I didn't have to maybe like square some of those contradictions, or there was a way to say like this isn't like a cultural history. I'm not trying to construct like something that's just a tidy like here's like like this kind of forgotten or under represented moment in the history of AIDS art, and let me kind of present all the facts on it, and allowed certain liberties to get at certain arguments without being maybe like having like the same amount of like high like fidelity relationship with like different theorists or people like in these conversations, because there's a way to say, well, no, this is not like something that intends or needs to hold up as like an airtight piece of theory or art criticism or something like that. I don't know if that was a helpful answer, but I feel like finding some sort of like genre and then trying to just write within the constraints of that, I feel like is maybe a helpful way to approach voice.
I think my answer is a little similar, because I was really struggling, and then I thought I always like writing on movies, and especially also things that I think are kind of wrong or like an injustice of some sort. So I don't know, as soon as I watched The Social Dilemma, I was like, that's annoying. Immediately I like wanted to say stuff about it. So I think maybe that's a genre thing too, like write about a film, like critique a film. But I would say that I have not yet like not solved that problem, but the thesis was like part of tackling the issue of voice, because it's so hard for me, because I did some like journalism before, and with that you don't have a voice, it's just like efficiency and get the facts across. And so I think figuring out voice and like trusting it without being like, what should I write, what do they want me to write, like that's still something that's super hard. But I do think forcing yourself to write a thesis is like a great way to get rid of like the top half of it, I guess. So I feel like, I don't know, now feel more ready to trust my voice. This doesn't sound like I'm trusting my voice, but and also like listening to Ryan's, I really love the personal aspects of it and the way you articulate certain things. Because I think that's the struggle too, is I'm like, oh, I can't work it out through the thing I'm writing. For some reason, I think it has to be like, academic every word. But yeah, so that's not really an answer, but more of a rambling on my inspiration in place.
Maybe to like also piggyback off what you were saying, I think like one thing that's tremendously helpful with like kind of like putting one of these like thesis research projects together is to like as much as possible just try to pick like the one, you know, the one thing or like the one book, or like, you know, if you're like working with like a lot of theory, like, okay, here's like the, you know, 2 or 3 theorists that I'm really going to kind of like, you know, bring in, because I definitely like, I feel like my thesis started as like, I came in very, you know, kind of like ambitious, like I'm going to write this thing about all of AIDS literature, and, which is, it would have taken, it would be like it's like a PhD dissertation or something. And I feel like lost like significant amounts of time just trying to find like continually like square that or find a way to, you know, like change like the perspective I was looking at to like make that all this stuff fit in. And I think as soon as you like strip that away and just make it way easier for yourself and say like, I'm gonna like take this one book or this writer, like, you know, this movie or whatever, you know, it, like even if you're still kind of like working in the same register of like, oh, there's this bigger like thing that I have in mind that is like actually what I'm trying to like intervene on, it just makes like getting to those questions way easier because you can actually like dig into something in depth, and also just like saves you so much time and stress that otherwise like I found at least like that's like really debilitating after a while, like just trying to like take on too much in a way that it almost like just harms the project, you know.
Definitely. Last thing is I definitely feel like I could have just done the whole thing on the social one. Like I tried to do these other chapters and that they just kind of were tacked on at the end, you know, a little bit half baked. And I think it's like, yeah, picking one thing. Or like I had earlier ideas and I was like, yeah, I gotta have 5 of these and 3 of these people, and I could have just picked one of the people and just gone into that. So I would that is great advice. Don't be like expanding it so much.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you. So I may have a personal question regarding, just curious about how you guys think about the responsibility of media theorists or critics or cultural critics. Like, how would you situate yourself in the, you know, the dilemma of contemporary culture, and how would you, you know, reflect upon your position, you know, in regard to the public opinion, the popularity of the current media, and also you being a critic and being a cultural critic who really keep track of what's the general trend of nowadays social media or cultural trend, and how would you, you know, bring your thesis maybe to a broader audiences? And I'm just wondering, like, yeah, in short, how would you consider your responsibilities or position as a media critic or cultural critic?
Yeah, I guess I can speak to the responsibility thing a little bit, which I mean, I definitely like in writing a thesis like on like the AIDS epidemic, and definitely taking somewhat of a position of actually digging into like critiques and saying like, well, like maybe like some of these issues or like problems we can point to, and, you know, kind of like contemporary discourse around something like AIDS, you know, maybe in part unintentionally like a bit of like the kernel of what became this discursive problems baked into like AIDS activism itself, and you're kind of taking there's a lot. I think the responsibility thing is definitely, you know, I think weighed in a lot with writing this thesis, because it felt like it's material that needed to be handled with a lot of care, and there's a lot of danger in being flippant with something like that, you know, just, or like there's a way in which if you're not careful about it, it can come off as like contrarian for the sake of like, you know, having a, you know, idiosyncratic like critical opinion about something. But so in that, I would think the responsibility stuff, I think what I was always just thinking about is that just trying to like always shoot for like as being as generous of a reader as possible. And, you know, really trying to, you know, there's a lot of like a read, you know, like if there's like an essay that was like digging into, you know, try to like really kind of read up on like the background, like biography of the person who wrote the essay, you know, and understanding which institutions they were part of, and just trying to, so in that sense, that was like a thing that I think was recurrent when I was writing. yeah. Besides that, I guess maybe I don't maybe know as much how to respond to the other question of like, I guess how this thesis relates to like doing critical work like outside of the program. Is maybe like going back to the genre thing. Like there's a way where like you're spending a lot of time researching and writing something, and I think there's a value in looking at that and saying, well, this is something that I can actually try to do something with afterwards, and I think it's worthwhile to think of the thesis that way, not like entirely as something that's like kind of this like just careerist tool, but so that's like a serious component of it, that when you like leave the program, that's kind of the main thing that you carry with you, of something to say, like to take to other people and say, hey, I've done this or I've done that. And I did a interview with like Dennis Cooper for a magazine. It's partially out of like wanting to do that, for my own research interests, and it played into the actual thesis writing itself. But that was something that now is fun, and I'm working as an editor at that magazine. So there's like ways to like try to think about the thesis work you're doing and try to connect it to just a position or something of like where you maybe want to see yourself headed after the program. Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling. I don't know if those are totally helpful answer or not, but
yeah, that really got me. Sorry, that really got me thinking. I don't know. It makes me think. With my thesis, I thought originally it was going to be like involve lesson plans and teaching and stuff. But then I think in doing it, I was like, I don't know anything. I have no answers. Like I can't be like, I don't know, putting it into something to then give to it. I don't know. So I felt a bit not ready for that. And I guess now looking back on that impulse, I feel like, I don't know, I guess the responsibility part, I feel like the responsibility is more to create something that's like unique to you. So like not like what lesson plan did that person make, but what do I have to offer? Like what is that unique perspective and how can I share it with people? So I feel like back to the voice thing, it's like not determined yet, but I do think, oh no, I lost my thought. Oh yeah, I do think part of it, at least for me, is like talking to people about what you're working on. And those conversations are always really great. And that's part of what was in my conclusion is like, not it was called like anti-modernism or against progress, so like not being like I have to change the world with my programs, like, but instead just being like my friend Joe and I had a really good conversation about like what I'm working on. And I think like for the next stuff I want to work on, I want to try to like make it as true to me as possible, and then the sharing of that is the fulfilling of the responsibility, because I think before it was like pressure, it's like you better change the world with this thing, which is ridiculous. So but yeah, that's what I'm saying. Also basically, but yeah.
Well, in the interest of time, maybe we'll close it out. So join me in giving them a hand again. And also just a huge round of thank yous. Thank you so much for making the time to come present. Thanks Shu, who's unfortunately had to go a little bit early. Thanks Sam and the library. Thank Amanda and the School of Critical Studies. And I'm here to talk about anything about aesthetics of politics, if anyone ever wants to. And I want to thank Jackie and Rosa for making the event possible today. A lot of work.
And David.
Oh, and David. Yeah. So thank you so much to everybody.